Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites throughout communities in the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and Easthampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the burial grounds of Easthampton throughout history. And so tell us about the Protestant cemeteries of Easthampton.
Yes, that'll be a good start because there's more Protestant cemeteries than there are Catholics. Not every community has it in that order, but we'll talk about that denomination next. And we'll also talk about some of the cemeteries that have moved or have been lost. And that's interesting. How do you lose a cemetery? Well, it happens. All right, so some of the Protestant ones that are around, well, I'll tell you about some of the first ones. Of course, there was the first cemetery, and that is the one that's lost. That's where the pioneers were. I'll tell you more later. And then there's Old Center Cemetery, which also was moved, and thus I'll tell you about that one later too. So the three Protestant cemeteries never moved and not lost are East Street Cemetery, where it's close to East Street, but not quite on it anymore. But that's a very interesting cemetery because a lot of the pioneers of Easthampton are located inside there. And I'm going to have a tour inside there next year. In fact, three Protestant cemeteries are going to have a tour of them inside them next year. And what I'm going to do is tell you about those first burials, why the stones are arranged certain ways, and in this case, who the gates are named after. And then there's the Main Street Cemetery, which had the old Center Cemetery moved into its back center. And there are more pioneers, but also there's Samuel Williston towards the back left. And there's some modern burials off to the right, especially far right and right front. And then the Brookside Cemetery, the most modern Protestant cemetery, which is a garden-style cemetery, which is right on Neshowannock Pond. And it's, of course, quite gorgeous in places, but it, too, has a very interesting story, even though it's the youngest of all. It has interesting gravestones and stories, and, of course, it's the most beautiful of all.
And tell us about the Catholic cemeteries in town.
All right. The first Catholic cemetery is a moved one. It only had one person inside of it, and that was the Immaculate Conception Churchyard. And Jeremiah Twomey is buried there, and he was buried in 1873, right alongside the church. It might be to the left or right of the church, but it was moved into the St. Bridget's Cemetery at some point. So it's no longer near that church anymore. The reason why, when they had the original church there, it was much smaller. When they built the brick and mortar church, they probably moved that grave at that point. And so thus it was a churchyard cemetery, one person. And then there was the St. Bridget's Cemetery, a very large Catholic cemetery by Lower Mill Pond. And there you have three different ethnic groups buried there. The Irish, Quebec, and the Polish are buried in that cemetery. In 1924, finally, the Polish got their own cemetery called the St. Stanislaus Cemetery. They had their 100th anniversary this year. And in that cemetery, you got a great view of the Mount Tom and Mount Holyoke Ranges. It's a very gorgeous cemetery, well arranged with an outdoor chapel. Now, the St. Bridget's Cemetery has a priest circle area, and back in there you can find, for instance, one of the first couple priests, but also Jeremiah Twomey is buried in the front of that priest circle. In the back is a pastor from Poland who was one of the first pastors of the Polish church, and he's buried with his graveyard, a gravestone inscription pointing inwards towards a bush. And I hope the church will sometime move that stone. All right.
And quickly, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for any of his various tours or find out more information, you can check out his website at hoyokcanaltour.org. And there you can find podcasts and videos of the stops on each of his tours, as well as videos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for other inquiries or to book a private tour, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 @yahoo.com. And his tours are fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what happened to the old center burial grounds?
Okay, that's where the Providence Church is now, and now there's a daycare. But that was a burial ground which had a lot of the early people of Easthampton. It was very close to Town Green. It's very close to the old town hall. And it was moved when they put that church in. And they moved it to the back center of the Main Street Cemetery. And back there's about 40 stones and maybe more burials than stones. And there's a location back there which was a holding tomb. And to the left, right, and front of that, you'll find these old stones that used to be at this very old center cemetery. Now, when they put in the chapel towards the back of the Providence Church, they found more burials, probably because that was the potter's field, or the paupers, and they didn't have stones associated with them, and they neglected to dig them up in 1866 when they moved the rest of the stones and the burials from the front of the cemetery. So those were taken out in the 1880s or 1890s and moved also into the Main Street Cemetery. So very interesting subject. Thus, there are two cemeteries that have been moved completely, the old Center Cemetery and the Immaculate Conception Churchyard.
And tell us about the first cemetery and what happened to it.
Okay, so very interesting. And remember, the pioneers came around to Easthampton out of Northampton, and they settled very, very close to the Connecticut River. And back then, there was a big meander, which is now cut off, and that forms the Oxbow, but that was the flowing Connecticut River back 300 years ago. Now, in 1704, I believe, Native Americans invaded the location where the settlers in Easthampton were located. They attacked and killed many natives, probably anywhere between 14 to 17 natives died during that attack. Now, since the pioneers had been living out there anyways, they already had a graveyard out there, but they didn't put stones down in typical fashion because they were afraid the Native Americans would desecrate them, or they were afraid the natives would figure out where the people were living anyways, so they wanted to keep it secret. And when they buried the massacred victims from 1704, they buried them again without stones so the natives couldn't find them. Now, the problem with that is that you might put a tiny stone to mark where your graves are, but that gets lost, and now they're somewhere in a farmer's field, very close to Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary, and no one can pinpoint where they are, right? They're pretty sure they're in this one farmer's field, but there's no way of really finding out unless you do ground penetrating radar on the entire system and try to find deep holes that were dug in that area. Those might be the burials, but that hasn't been done yet. So you have a very interesting subject in your hand, a lost cemetery.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Thank you for tuning in to our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and Easthampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing Easthampton, Massachusetts, and its history. So tell us some of the highlights in regards to the historical sites within the community.
Probably they would be the Williston Mills, and then which were at two different locations. And then there's some others, of course. The Williston Seminary is one. And all the many churches and cemeteries it has another. And it has some beautiful parks, and it has the whole Mount Tom Range going along its eastern side. So there's a lot around. And there's special unique things like Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuaries in town. And so there's quite a bit to do in Easthampton if you look around, and quite a bit of historical items. The Easthampton Historical Society is very active. And now, probably the thing that stands out are the bodies of water that are in Easthampton. People think that they're ponds, and they have many ponds at all, but actually they're all backed up by dams, which means they aren't ponds, they're reservoirs. They're fed by brooks, and they're made into places in the past, 200 years ago, which would have power mills. Hydro-mechanical power wheels would serve the power for them. All right, so today we're going to talk about these cemeteries and churches, and see some of these mills. And also we're going to talk about other really cool historical sites, of which are my favorites. All right, well, the upper mill and the lower mill were made to serve the Wilson Mills, and the Wilson Mills were very successful. One was a button factory, and I'm going to have a tour at one of these this year, and hopefully in the future I'll have it at the other one also. And Samuel Williston really made the town successful because of these really highly functional mills. But by 1900 or so, the West Boylston Mills came into town from West Boylston, Massachusetts, and they really elevated things even more. So it's quite a place, and of course, like any industrial site, Massachusetts was the center of the Industrial Revolution in America, and like any industrial site, they would want to have a power source. They didn't use canals, but they used dams on these brooks and backed them up and used that for reserve water power. That's where the word reservoir comes from. All right, so I do a lot of communities in Easthampton. It's fitting into the what the other communities were like, but it's different because you have different companies coming in and different types of water power.
And how do the cemeteries tie into the history?
All right, they have some really nice looking cemeteries here. But in fact, the Pioneer Cemetery of Easthampton is lost. The one that was around Fort Hill and where the first pioneers of Easthampton settled, that is not findable. No one has ever found it. And it also became a place where a lot of the victims of a Native American massacre happen to have been buried. And so you're not only losing the old pioneer death, you're losing these victims' death. It's somewhere out in a farmer's field, but no one's quite found it yet. It's just for a note, it's around Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary, and it has a marker there that'll help you find it. Now it has a typical two Catholic cemeteries around town, St. Bridget, St. Stanislaus. There used to be a churchyard cemetery at the Immaculate Conception for one pastor, and they moved that one. Okay, and then there's also the Protestant ones. A very old one was moved at some point, and that was moved from where the town hall is, and it moved into the Main Street Cemetery. There's also an East Street Cemetery, which is basically a neighborhood cemetery. And then they have a garden-style cemetery called the Brookside Cemetery. And that one takes on curved paths and a lot of trees and flowers, and it's a beautiful sight.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for other inquiries or for private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214B@yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. Getting back to our interview, and what about the churches? How do they connect to the history of Easthampton?
Of course, in Massachusetts, you always need to have a meeting house or a congregational church before you could actually break away from your parent town or city. And Easthampton is the last of all communities ever formed in Hampshire County. It used to be that Enfield was the last, but they were disincorporated. So Easthampton is the last. All right, so, and they were a breakaway like Southampton and Westhampton from Northampton. All right, so, what are the churches like here? Well, you have three Catholic churches that have joined together recently to make Our Lady of the Valley Parish, but the Immaculate Conception Church is definitely the largest of all those Catholic parishes. And it's a beautiful site. That church that's there now is from 1884, although the parish and original church are about 20 years older than that. And of course you have a French-Canadian Catholic church and a Polish church. Now as for the Protestants, they had their original Congregational church, right, and they also had the Payson Congregational, but the other denominations started coming in. A lot of Germans moved to Easthampton, and the German Evangelical Lutheran Church formed the Trinity Lutheran, and a couple of Episcopalian churches, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the St. Philip's. Now remember, it was connected a long time with Northampton, so its parent church is the First Church of Northampton, and then these others came later.
And does Easthampton preserve its history and historic sites?
Yes, they're very good at that. They have the Community Preservation Act, CPA, in Easthampton, and they're able to preserve churches, for instance, and they're able to buy up open spaces, which is great because they have a mountain range right along this eastern border. And a lot of these things have improved the life in Easthampton itself. And also they have a great bike path through town, so a lot of people can leisurely walk or ride on the bike path and see a lot of historical items along the way. For instance, the bike path goes behind the mill system, and those mills are very old. Okay, now, what else do they do, or what else should they do? They should actually fix up some of their cemeteries. Graveyard restorers are excellent nowadays. They can use a certain liquid that cleans very well a lot of these old stones without damaging it, and they can also fix the broken stones. So I've noticed around Easthampton they haven't been doing that, but I wish they did, because that alone would make everything really sharp and looking great. And like I said, the Historical Society of Easthampton is quite active, and they help in helping people determine how old their houses are and keeping their records straight, and they have a lot of data there Most communities keep their data in the libraries, but in Easthampton, they basically keep it at their historical society.
And I know my particular favorite part of Easthampton sites are the Christian box memorials, the state Christmas box, the state Stanislaus Cemetery, and the Williston Academy campus. So thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of our other podcasts on his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new videos and podcasts posted daily.